It is. I'm so glad that you are celebrating. I hosted my first WoW meeting.
Everything looked perfect at the royal banquet in Windsor Castle. Fancy lights, important guests, and a lot of tradition. But behind the scenes, there was drama. Queen Camilla didn't let Princess Charlotte attend the event. This upset Princess Catherine, mother of the future queen, who stood up for her daughter. It began with a name left off a list, not a foreign dignitary or distant cousin, but Princess Charlotte, the daughter of the future king. Her exclusion wasn't a clerical error, it was a decision. And according to palace insiders, that decision came directly from Queen Camilla. This was supposed to be an evening of celebration, not conflict. But when Princess Catherine discovered what had been done, she didn't raise her voice or demand an explanation. Instead, she chose something far more powerful. She arrived, and when she did, she brought Charlotte with her. In that moment, tradition met resistance, and resistance walked through the doors with its head held high. This wasn't just a banquet, it was a reckoning. Quiet, deliberate, and unforgettable. The banquet was meant to be a display of royal unity, a seamless evening at Windsor Castle, crafted to reassure the world that the crown and all it represents remains intact. Diplomats were flying in from Europe. Nobles from Scandinavia and the Middle East had confirmed their attendance. Even prominent figures from British high society were expected to appear. The event's theme, Bridging Generations, was chosen with care, meant to highlight the seamless passage of duty from one era to the next. Behind the scenes, the preparations had been rigorous. Seating charts had gone through 10 drafts. The menu had been revised 3 times. Nothing was left to chance. But when the final guest list was quietly distributed among senior aides for final approval, one name's absence stood out. Not because it was grand or expected, but because it was personal. Princess Charlotte. Her name wasn't on the list. Not misplaced, not moved. It was missing. When an aide at Kensington Palace raised the omission, the response from Clarence House was short and carefully worded. The Queen Consort preferred that this year's banquet be reserved for adults only. But even that explanation didn't hold. Prince George, Charlotte's older brother, had received his invitation weeks earlier. So had several foreign royal children, some even younger than Charlotte. It wasn't policy, it was selective. The message was clear, even if no one dared say it aloud. This wasn't a miscommunication, it was a choice. Inside Adelaide Cottage, Catherine read the line twice before setting the paper down in silence. She had felt the shift coming, an undercurrent of tension during the weeks leading up to the banquet. Charlotte had asked more than once what she would wear if she could help greet guests, if she would stand beside her mother like George had done in the past. Catherine had gently encouraged her to wait. Now she understood why that feeling had lingered. The decision, once revealed, cut deeper than the event itself. It wasn't just about a seat at a table. It was about presence, recognition, value. The palace could dress it in protocol, but Catherine knew better. This wasn't about age. It was about erasure, and that she would not allow. Inside Adelaide Cottage, the atmosphere had shifted. The quiet hum of a typical royal evening, homework at the table, the dog snoring in the corner, the distant click of staff preparing tea, was replaced by something colder. A silence that didn't feel restful. It felt deliberate, heavier. Catherine sat alone in her study for a long time after receiving the official word. The guest list had been finalized. The decision was final. There would be no invitation for Charlotte. It wasn't a suggestion or a misunderstanding. It was a choice. And behind that choice stood Queen Camilla. At first, Catherine said nothing. She didn't speak to William, didn't call her mother, didn't storm through palace corridors. She didn't have to. She'd learned over the years that in the royal family, the most powerful weapons were rarely words. They were presence, stillness, timing. Meanwhile, Charlotte was unaware of the decision that had already begun shaping the next few days. She was in her room, carefully folding napkins for her imaginary table setup, mimicking the way she'd seen staff prepare for state dinners. For weeks, she had been watching her mother's posture, practicing her curtsy, asking if she could help greet the guests when they arrived. The childlike enthusiasm in her voice made Catherine's heart ache more than she expected. But the moment the truth became visible was painfully simple. Charlotte came skipping into the sitting room, holding the edge of a dress in her hand. It was a deep navy blue, slightly too formal for a child her age, but she had insisted on trying it on the moment the idea of the banquet had first been mentioned. She held it up, eyes bright. "Mummy, should I wear this one for the banquet?" Catherine looked up, and her heart caught in her throat. She smiled, soft but strained, and told Charlotte to wait. "Let's see what the final plan is," she said gently. "We'll decide together." But Charlotte wasn't convinced. She had waited long enough. That night, before bed, she asked again, "Am I not invited?" The room went quiet, the kind of silence that even a child can recognize. Catherine didn't answer immediately. She sat beside her daughter on the edge of the bed, brushing her fingers through her hair. Charlotte looked up. "Did I do something wrong?" Catherine's breath caught. Not because the question was unexpected, but because she had seen this moment before. She had seen Diana, decades ago, walking the line between royal rules and maternal instinct. And now, here she was, doing the same, shielding a daughter from something she should never have had to understand at such a young age. Exclusion wrapped in protocol. She pulled Charlotte into her arms, holding her close. "No, sweetheart, you did everything right," she whispered. "Sometimes grown-ups make choices that don't make sense to children. That doesn't mean they're right." Charlotte didn't cry, but her posture changed. She rested her head quietly on her mother's shoulder, not needing more explanation. Children know when they've been left out. They may not grasp the politics behind it, but they feel the sting all the same. In the following days, palace staff tried to distract her. They arranged an impromptu afternoon tea with a cousin. They scheduled a trip to the Royal Mews, but nothing landed. Charlotte had rehearsed for this moment, not in words, but in the quiet, proud gestures of a child who had seen her older brother stepping further into royal life and wanted to do the same. This banquet was supposed to be her moment, and someone had taken it from her. That someone, Catherine knew, had done it with precision. Camilla had grown more assertive in recent months, taking stronger control over ceremonial protocol. From subtle changes in seating arrangements to the way her name appeared in briefings, she was drawing lines. Lines that didn't include Charlotte. But Catherine wasn't just a princess. She was a mother, and she had made up her mind. If her daughter wasn't offered a seat at the table, she would walk her through the door anyway. No one would erase her child. Not quietly, not ever. While most eyes were fixed on the glamour of the banquet preparations, those who worked behind palace doors knew there was more at play than seating charts and dress codes. What had happened to Princess Charlotte wasn't the result of a clerical error or a misread memo. It had been a decision, and the source of that decision was not a committee or a long-standing rule. It was Queen Camilla. According to senior aides, there had been no discussion, no room for negotiation. Camilla had signed off on the final guest list personally, and when asked about Charlotte's exclusion, she responded with clipped finality. "She's too young. This is not the time." The words were delivered calmly, without emotion, but no one believed they were about age. Not really. Charlotte had already attended high-profile events, state funerals, coronation rehearsals, public walkabouts. She had shown poise well beyond her years. Her absence wasn't about readiness, it was about boundaries. Ones Camilla was beginning to draw more firmly. In recent months, insiders had noticed subtle shifts in Camilla's behavior. She had begun exerting more influence over ceremonial details, requesting adjustments to press releases, inserting her personal insignia into visual materials, even reshuffling seating at high-profile events. Nothing overt, nothing loud, but enough to signal a change in tone. She was no longer just filling a role, she was shaping it. One palace staffer put it simply, "Camilla has stopped asking permission." That shift hadn't gone unnoticed, least of all by Catherine. What made this moment different was the person affected. Charlotte wasn't just another royal child. She was the daughter of the future king, a symbol of the next generation, and, as many have quietly observed, a growing reminder of Princess Diana. The resemblance was not just in her features, but in her grace, her composure, her presence. Some suspected Camilla saw that too. While there's no official comment on Camilla's personal motivations, those close to the situation believe this was not a simple decision about one child at one banquet. It was a signal, a way of defining who belonged where, a quiet reassertion of boundaries. One aide described it as a line drawn right through a child. But if Camilla had anticipated quiet compliance, she had miscalculated. Catherine had watched how power moved in the monarchy. She had seen what was said aloud, and more importantly, what wasn't. She recognized the difference between royal protocol and personal politics. And this exclusion was not protocol. It was personal. And now, the lines being drawn behind closed doors were about to be tested in public. Because Catherine wasn't planning to argue. She was planning to arrive. There's a certain stillness that descends over a royal household when something is about to change. It's not loud or chaotic. It's quiet, too quiet. That was the air inside Adelaide Cottage, in the hours after the guest list confirmation. The palace had made its decision. Charlotte would not attend the banquet, and Queen Camilla's word was final. But Catherine didn't respond the way some expected. There were no slammed doors, no panicked calls to palace aides, no demands to revise the list. That wasn't her way. Catherine had spent years mastering the rhythm of royal life, the silences, the protocol, the unspoken hierarchies. But beneath her calm surface was a steel spine, and this time it had straightened. That evening, after Charlotte had gone to bed, Catherine stood at the window of her private study. The light was low, her phone resting silently in her hand. She wasn't waiting for a callback. She wasn't seeking permission. She was deciding what needed to be done. Aides who had known her since her early days in the family recognized the shift instantly. Catherine didn't speak much when she was planning something. Her power didn't come from public defiance. It came from timing, precision, intent. She understood that in the royal family, optics were everything. Protocol could be bent without ever appearing broken. And sometimes just showing up could say more than any official statement ever could. She wasn't going to argue with Camilla. There would be no confrontation, no dramatic showdown behind closed doors. That would only feed into palace tension and headlines. No, her answer would come quietly, through action. She would bring Charlotte to the banquet, whether the list said so or not. The call she placed that night was short and composed. An aide at Windsor answered. Catherine's voice was calm. Director. She didn't ask to speak with anyone in charge. She didn't debate or explain. She simply stated the facts. Princess Charlotte will be attending the banquet. The pause on the other end was heavy. Yes, ma'am, came the reply. There was no pushback, no confusion. The weight of her authority as the Princess of Wales didn't need to be asserted. It was understood. She ended the call with a thank you and returned to her desk, where a navy envelope lay unopened. Inside, it was a printed schedule for the evening, a breakdown of arrivals, seating arrangements, and presentation order. Charlotte's name was nowhere to be found, and yet Catherine smiled to herself. It didn't matter. Across the palace, Clarence House aides were beginning to stir. Word of Catherine's decision traveled quickly. Staff began to speculate. Would she actually go through with it? Would she really bring Charlotte in full view of the press, the foreign royals, the diplomats? Surely not. Surely it would be walked back. But those who truly understood her knew better. This wasn't a reckless choice. It wasn't emotional. It was deliberate. At Adelaide Cottage, the tone shifted. Catherine personally selected Charlotte's dress. Midnight blue silk with pearl beading. Understated but regal. It was a nod, not just to elegance, but to legacy. The design echoed one of Diana's most iconic gowns. The message was quiet but unmistakable. Charlotte asked no questions that morning. She sensed the gravity of the moment without needing it explained. Her mother moved with intention. There was no hesitation, only quiet care. As Catherine helped her dress, she clasped a silver locket around Charlotte's neck and whispered, "You belong there." Outside, photographers were already gathering near the gates of Windsor. They were expecting a familiar scene: dignitaries, carriages, smiles, waves. What they would capture instead was a turning point. Because when Catherine made her decision, it wasn't about breaking rules. It was about protecting something sacred, her daughter's dignity. And when the car pulled away from Adelaide Cottage, carrying a future queen and the child they tried to leave behind, the palace didn't know it yet. But the story of the night had already changed. By early evening, Windsor Castle was alight with ceremony. Servants moved briskly through candlelit corridors, adjusting floral arrangements, polishing gold cutlery, and placing final touches on a room meant to dazzle. The air was heavy with perfume and anticipation. Guests were arriving in sleek black cars and stepping out onto crimson carpets, their names murmured in succession by uniformed footmen. Inside the ballroom, an orchestra rehearsed quietly behind velvet drapes. It was a scene designed for flawless execution. But beneath the perfection, something unspoken had started to spread. A murmur, a shift, a low vibration of awareness. Catherine was coming, and she wasn't coming alone. At Clarence's house, aides had scrambled for most of the day. Some believed she wouldn't go through with it. Others weren't so sure. Once she decides something for her children, one senior courtier muttered, "There's no walking it back." Still, the banquet list remained unchanged. No seat was added, no official adjustment made. If Catherine was going to bring her daughter, the institution would not move to meet her halfway. Camilla, outwardly composed, remained firm. Her morning briefing was clipped and brisk. She made no mention of Charlotte. She simply instructed her team to stick to the program and moved on. But even her closest aides could sense her unease. The stiffness in her shoulders, the slight pause before signing her name on the revised seating chart. She may have drawn the line, but she had no control over who would choose to cross it. Back at Adelaide Cottage, there was no panic, no rush. Catherine moved slowly, deliberately, like someone who had already calculated every step. She stood beside Charlotte's dressing table, smoothing out the folds of a navy silk gown that shimmered softly beneath the light. The gown had been chosen with care, formal enough for the occasion, subtle enough not to provoke. The neckline was modest, the hemline precise. It was the dress of someone who belonged, not someone trying to prove they did. Charlotte stood still, her small hands folded in front of her. She didn't ask questions, not about whether she was really going, not about who had said no. She simply watched her mother with wide, serious eyes. She had felt the weight of the moment. Not fully, perhaps, but enough to know that tonight mattered. When Catherine knelt beside her and clasped the silver locket around her neck, she whispered, "You have every right to be there." Charlotte nodded. As the car pulled through the gates of Windsor, cameras snapped to attention. The press had been waiting for routine arrivals. Foreign royals, British aristocrats, politicians in tailored tuxedos. But when the dark vehicle slowed and the door opened, the rhythm changed. First, Catherine stepped out, poised, calm, commanding without effort. Then, beside her, Charlotte emerged, hand in hand with her mother, dressed in midnight blue and holding her head high. A ripple moved through the crowd. Photographers hesitated, almost forgetting to press their shutters. It wasn't just their presence that stunned people. It was the way they moved, with quiet intention, as if they belonged in that moment more than anyone else. Inside the castle, the reaction was swift but silent. Footmen exchanged uncertain glances. One aide whispered hurriedly into a receiver. The seat hadn't been prepared. No place card had been printed. And yet, here she was. The queen consort, already positioned at the far end of the ballroom, paused mid-conversation when she saw them enter. Her expression didn't break, but her posture stiffened. She lifted her glass, but didn't sip. Catherine didn't slow. She greeted a few guests with polite nods. She offered a gentle smile to a visiting ambassador. And all the while, she held Charlotte's hand. There were no words. There didn't need to be. Every step across that ballroom floor was its own statement. A child who had been left off the list was now at the center of the room, not because permission had been granted, but because a mother refused to ask for it. The moment Catherine and Charlotte crossed the threshold of the ballroom, the atmosphere changed. Not visibly, not dramatically, but undeniably. The orchestra continued to play, the servers moved in quiet formation, and the dignitaries carried on with polite conversation. But the undercurrent had shifted. A presence had entered that wasn't expected, wasn't welcomed by all, and yet couldn't be ignored. Guests glanced up mid-sentence, their eyes drawn not to the chandeliers or the gilded place settings, but to the image unfolding at the far end of the hall. Catherine, serene in silver blue satin, walked with quiet confidence. At her side, Charlotte moved in step, composed, graceful, every inch her mother's daughter. There had been no announcement, no change to the program, but from the moment they appeared, the original order of the evening felt altered. Aides near the Queen Consort exchanged uneasy glances. Camilla stood firm, her posture impeccable, her expression unreadable. But those closest to her noticed the shift, her shoulders tighter, her fingers wrapped more firmly around her glass. She didn't move to intercept. She didn't speak. She watched. There was no confrontation, no words exchanged, just a silent reckoning, unfolding beneath the soft light of the chandeliers. Catherine continued her path through the room, stopping only briefly to greet a few guests. Charlotte smiled gently when spoken to, her voice quiet but confident. It wasn't the performance of a child, it was the poise of someone who had been told she belonged. When they reached the long dining table, Catherine pulled out a chair. It wasn't assigned to Charlotte. There was no name card waiting. But Catherine came prepared. From her clutch, she produced a folded card, printed in soft gold lettering, Princess Charlotte of Wales. She placed it on the table beside the fine china and took her seat. No one objected. No one dared. The room continued on, the music rising gently in the background. But a silent message had been delivered, one the monarchy wouldn't forget. A child had arrived. A mother had ensured it. And in that moment, centuries of tradition bowed to something far more powerful than protocol. Presents? Dinner had begun, but the tension hadn't eased. Charlotte's presence, though small in stature, had altered the entire tone of the evening. There was no official place for her, no name card, no revised seating chart. But none of that mattered, because she was here, sitting quietly beside her mother, where she had always belonged. Catherine didn't seek attention. She didn't demand space. She created it. From her clutch, she'd removed a folded card with Charlotte's name, written in soft gold script, and placed it on the table without a word. The gesture was quiet, but unmistakable. The monarchy had drawn its lines. Catherine had redrawn them. Charlotte, unaware of the full stakes, behaved with flawless grace. She smiled when spoken to, thanked the servers, and followed her mother's lead. Her calm demeanor said more than any defense ever could. Across the room, Camilla held her posture, but her silence spoke volumes. She didn't acknowledge Charlotte. She didn't object, but her hands, resting on the tablecloth, were stiff. Staff noticed. So did the guests. One aide scribbled Charlotte's name onto an unofficial chart. It wasn't printed or approved, but it was accepted. No one stopped her. No one dared. In that moment, Catherine didn't break protocol. She rewrote it. As the second course was cleared, a new kind of silence fell over the room. Not awkward, not cold, just aware. Something had shifted. Guests still laughed, still raised their glasses, but the center of gravity had moved, and everyone knew it. Catherine and Charlotte had not made a scene. They had simply arrived and settled in, but it was enough to send tremors through a system built on unspoken rules. Camilla avoided looking down the table. Her smile remained fixed, but her eyes had lost their warmth. There were no whispers from her end, only the kind of stillness that comes when a plan hasn't unfolded the way it was meant to. Catherine, by contrast, was steady. She offered Charlotte a sip of water, helped her unfold a napkin, and engaged in casual conversation like nothing was out of place, because to her, nothing was. An usher quietly passed along an altered seating chart. Charlotte's name had been added in pen, quick, unofficial, but there all the same. The monarchy hadn't spoken, but it had conceded. Charlotte looked up at her mother after dessert, her eyes bright, her shoulders straighter than before. She wasn't on the list, but she had arrived, and now she couldn't be unseen. By the time dessert was served, something remarkable had taken place. Not in the spotlight, but just outside of it. The monarchy, known for tradition and rigidity, had been quietly redefined by a mother and her daughter who were never supposed to be the center of the story. Charlotte didn't demand attention. She didn't wave or speak out of turn. She simply sat with composure, engaging in soft conversation with a visiting princess from Denmark who complimented her locket. She smiled, responded politely, and glanced to her mother for reassurance. That one glance said everything. Catherine hadn't come to cause disruption. She had come to restore balance. Those seated near them felt it. The dignity, the calm, the unspoken statement, "We belong here." One dignitary, overheard in a conversation later, put it plainly. "It was the most graceful power move I've ever seen." Camilla, still seated at the far end of the table, lifted her glass during closing remarks. Her laughter was softer now, her posture more guarded. She had not lost control, but she had lost the narrative. And in a monarchy where image shapes legacy, that mattered more than anything. Somewhere near the back of the room, a note was passed between aides. "Adjust official photos," it read. "Include Charlotte. No apology, no explanation, just quiet course correction." The knight had spoken, and the crown had listened. The morning after the banquet, Windsor Castle stood in perfect order, but inside the palace, everything felt different. The newspapers hadn't run the story, at least not directly. There were no headlines about defiance or drama, but the photos said enough. Catherine in pale silver, Charlotte beside her in midnight blue, hand in hand. The image had already circulated across social media, shared with admiration, dissected with curiosity, and though the palace remained silent, the ripple effect was undeniable. Inside Clarence's house, Camilla was notably absent from her usual weekend briefing. Officially, she was resting. Unofficially, she was regrouping. Aides described her mood as tight-lipped and uncharacteristically reserved. She hadn't lost face in public, but within the royal circle, her authority had been challenged. Not with scandal, but with presence. Meanwhile, Catherine made no comment. She walked Charlotte to school on Monday as if nothing had happened, but those who saw her at the gates noticed a subtle change, a straighter posture, a longer glance, and from Charlotte, the same, the quiet confidence of someone who had been seen and protected. No statement was issued, none was needed, because within the monarchy, some messages are too loud for press releases. They echo in actions, and this one had echoed clearly. When protocol clashes with motherhood, the crown bends. Maybe not forever, but for one night, it did. Every royal event is designed to leave a mark, a speech, a photo, a ceremonial gesture captured for the history books. But the most defining moments often aren't scripted. They aren't planned. They happen in silence, in resistance, in the quiet decision of one woman to do what no one expected. That night, Charlotte didn't need a title to be recognized. She didn't need to wear a crown to be seen. All she needed was her mother's hand and the strength that came with it. Catherine didn't protest in the press. She didn't rewrite palace policy. She simply walked in, placed her daughter at the table, and let the room adjust. And it did. In a family where legacy is inherited and protocol is sacred, Catherine reminded the monarchy and the public that true power doesn't always speak. Sometimes it simply shows up. Sometimes it's a child in a navy dress, sitting where she wasn't supposed to, teaching a room full of royals what grace really looks like. The banquet will be remembered, not for its speeches or floral arrangements, but for what it tried to erase, and what refused to stay erased. Charlotte's seat wasn't given, it was claimed, and the monarchy, whether it liked it or not, was changed by it. If you found this story as powerful as we did, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you never miss the untold truths behind palace walls. Share this with someone who believes grace can be stronger than tradition. And remember, history isn't just made by those at the top. Sometimes it's made by those who were never meant to be seen. Until next time.